The sky above central Oklahoma on the afternoon of September 29, 1986 was the color of old concrete. It was a heavy, oppressive gray that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. In the town of Edmond, a quiet suburb just north of Oklahoma City, the people were going about their business as usual. It was a Monday. The work week was just starting. Children were in school, parents were at their jobs. The air was thick and still, with that peculiar humidity that makes the heat cling to your skin. The kind of day that makes you feel like a storm is coming long before the first drop of rain ever falls. Edmond in 1986 was a growing community, proud of its schools and its safe streets. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where kids rode their bikes to the corner store, where the biggest worry was whether the high school football team would win on Friday night. The town sat on the rolling plains of central Oklahoma, a landscape that stretched out flat and wide to the horizon, with nothing but fields and ranches and the occasional cluster of trees to break up the monotony. And on that September afternoon, the people of Edmond had no idea that their lives were about to be turned upside down. The weather forecast that morning had been ordinary. The meteorologists on the local news had mentioned a chance of thunderstorms later in the day. It was September, after all. That was the season for it. The transition from summer to fall often brought unsettled weather. There was a cold front moving in from the northwest, colliding with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. That combination had all the ingredients for a strong storm, but no one was sounding any alarms, not yet. The day started off quiet, and for most of the morning that quiet held. By early afternoon, the conditions began to change. The temperature had climbed into the upper 70s, warm for late September. The humidity was rising too. The air felt heavy, almost sticky. The wind, which had been calm all morning, began to pick up. It came in gusts, shifting direction erratically, first from the south, then from the east, then back again. The clouds that had been thin and high in the morning began to thicken and lower. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had taken on that familiar, ominous look that Oklahomans knew all too well. It was the look of a tornado sky, but even with that look, nobody panicked. Tornadoes were a part of life in Oklahoma. People had grown up with them, they knew the drill. When the sirens went off, you went to the basement or the storm cellar, you took cover, you waited it out, and most of the time, nothing happened. The storms would blow through, drop a little hail, kick up some wind, and move on. The warning system was good, but it was not perfect. And on this day, the warning came too late for too many people. The storm that would produce the Edmond tornado began to develop around 3:30 in the afternoon. It was a supercell thunderstorm, a powerful rotating system that carried within it the potential for destruction. The storm formed along that cold front, feeding on the warm, moist air from the Gulf. It grew quickly, its updraft pulling in more and more energy. Within an hour, that storm had become a monster. And at the heart of that monster, a funnel cloud began to form. The first report of a tornado came in around 4 o'clock. A truck driver on Interstate 35, just north of Edmond, saw a funnel dip down from the base of the storm. He radioed it in. The National Weather Service issued a warning. The tornado was on the ground, and it was moving. The tornado touched down in a rural area just northwest of Edmond. At first, it was small, just a narrow rope of swirling cloud and debris. It kicked up dust and tore at the grass and crops. It was the kind of tornado that looks almost harmless from a distance, like a wisp of smoke rising from the ground, but it did not stay small for long. As it moved southeast toward the heart of Edmond, it began to grow. It widened, it strengthened. The rope became a wedge. The wedge became a monster. In the neighborhoods of northwest Edmond, people were just getting home from work. Kids were coming home from school. Parents were starting dinner. The first sign of trouble for many of them was the sound. It was a sound that few people had ever heard before. It was a roar. Not like a train, as so many people describe it, but more like the sound of 1,000 freight trains all running at once. A deep, continuous, vibrating roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was the sound of the sky tearing itself apart. The tornado struck the first homes around 4:15 in the afternoon. It hit with a fury that was almost indescribable. The winds were estimated at over 250 miles per hour. That is the wind speed of a strong F4 tornado on the Fujita scale, just shy of the most powerful category, F5. At those speeds, the air itself becomes a weapon. It can drive a piece of straw through a wooden plank. It can peel the pavement off a road. It can lift a car and toss it like a toy. The houses in the path of the tornado were built of wood and brick, but they might as well have been made of paper. The wind tore the roofs off first, then it ripped the walls apart. One by one, the homes were reduced to piles of rubble. The debris was caught up in the vortex, spinning in a deadly cloud. Wood, glass, metal, drywall, furniture, all of it became part of the tornado. It was a grinding, churning machine of destruction. In one neighborhood, a woman named Linda was in her kitchen when she heard the roar. She had just taken a casserole out of the oven. The house was quiet. Her husband was not home yet. Her two children were in the living room watching television. She called out to them. She told them to get to the hallway. That was the safest place in the house, she had always been told. The interior of the house away from windows. She grabbed her youngest child, a boy of 4, and pulled him into the hallway. Her older daughter, 7 years old, was right behind her. They huddled together on the floor. The roar grew louder. The house began to shake. Linda pressed her children against the wall and covered them with her body. She prayed. The tornado hit their house with a force that Linda would later describe as being hit by a giant. The roof lifted off. The walls exploded outward. The floor beneath them buckled and twisted. Linda held onto her children as tightly as she could. She felt herself being lifted, pulled upward by the suction of the storm. She was weightless for a moment, floating in the chaos. And then she was thrown. She landed in the yard next door, still holding her son. Her daughter was nearby, dazed and crying. The house was gone. Everything they owned was scattered across the neighborhood. But Linda and her children were alive. Not everyone was so lucky. In another home just a few blocks away, a man named Robert had just walked in the door from work. He heard the sirens. He told his wife and their 2 teenage sons to get into the basement. They were halfway down the stairs when the tornado hit. The house collapsed on top of them. Rescue workers would spend hours digging through the rubble, pulling out bodies one by one. Robert survived, but his wife and sons did not. In the aftermath, he would wander through the ruins of his neighborhood, searching for anything that reminded him of the life he had lost. The tornado carved a path through the heart of Edmond. It was a path of total destruction, about a quarter-mile wide and nearly 6 miles long. It crossed streets and highways, plowed through subdivisions, and leveled everything in its way. It hit the Oak Tree subdivision, a newer development with large homes and tree-lined streets. The trees were snapped in half. The homes were flattened. The streets themselves were buried under piles of debris. At the intersection of 2 major roads, the tornado hit a strip mall. It tore the roof off a grocery store. It shattered the windows of a pharmacy. It flipped cars in the parking lot and tossed them into the building. The people inside the store had taken shelter in the walk-in cooler. They could hear the storm raging outside. They could feel the building shaking. When they opened the door after the storm had passed, they saw nothing but sky above them. The roof was gone. The walls were gone. The store was an open shell. The tornado moved on, leaving a trail of destruction behind it. It hit a school, an elementary school, but thank God school had let out hours earlier. The building was empty. The tornado tore off the roof and blew out the windows. It damaged classrooms and hallways, but there were no children inside. That was the first miracle of the day. The second miracle came at a nursing home. The tornado struck the facility as the evening shift was arriving. The staff had just started serving dinner. The sirens went off. The nurses and aides quickly moved the residents into the hallways and interior rooms. They put mattresses over the bedridden patients. They held hands and prayed. The tornado hit the building hard. It ripped off the roof. It caved in walls. It shattered windows, but not a single person inside was killed. The staff had done everything right. They had gotten everyone to safety in time. It was the second miracle, but the third miracle never came. The tornado continued its path of destruction, and it was not done yet. It reached the eastern edge of Edmond, where the houses gave way to open fields. Seemed to be weakening, losing its grip on the ground. And then it lifted. The funnel rose back into the clouds. The rain stopped. The wind died down. The roar faded into silence. The worst was over, but the damage had been done. In the immediate aftermath, the people of Edmond came out of their shelters, out of their basements, out of their bathtubs and closets and hallways. They stepped into a world that had been turned upside down. The streets were covered in debris. Trees were down. Power lines were snapped. Houses were broken open like eggs. The air was thick with dust and the smell of natural gas. There was a strange quiet, broken only by the sound of people calling out for their loved ones and the distant wail of emergency sirens. The first responders were already on the scene. Police, firefighters, paramedics. They came from Edmond and from the surrounding communities. They came from Oklahoma City. They came from anywhere they could. They set up triage centers in the parking lots of damaged grocery stores. They used chainsaws to cut through fallen trees. They used their bare hands to dig through rubble. They worked through the night searching for survivors. The National Guard was called in to secure the area and prevent looting. The Red Cross set up shelters for the homeless. Volunteers arrived with food and water and blankets. The community came together in a way that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers helped strangers. Everyone was united in the common goal of survival and recovery. But even as the rescue efforts began, the full scope of the tragedy was becoming clear. The death toll was rising. By the end of the night, the count would reach 13. 13 people had been killed by the Edmond tornado. 13 lives lost in a matter of minutes. Among the dead were children, parents, grandparents, people who had been going about their ordinary day never knowing that it would be their last. One of the victims was a young mother named Susan. She was at home with her 2 children, a baby and a toddler, when the tornado struck. She had no basement. She had no storm cellar. She did the only thing she could. She gathered her children in the bathroom and held them close. The tornado ripped the roof off the house and the walls collapsed. Susan shielded her children with her own body. She took the brunt of the falling debris. When the rescuers found them, Susan was dead, but her children were alive, protected by her sacrifice. Another victim was an elderly man named Harold. He had lived in Edmond for over 40 years. He had survived the Dust Bowl. He had survived World War II. He had survived every storm that Oklahoma had ever thrown at him. But this time he was not so lucky. He was in his living room when the tornado hit. The house collapsed on top of him. His wife survived. She was in the kitchen and the kitchen walls held, but Harold was gone. The stories of loss and survival multiplied as the night wore on. Every family had a story. Every street had a tragedy. The tornado had touched so many lives, had taken so much, and the people of Edmond were left to pick up the pieces. In the days that followed, the community would come together in ways that would be remembered for decades. They would hold funerals. They would comfort the grieving. They would rebuild their homes and their lives. But the scars of that September day would never fully heal. The Edmond Tornado of 1986 became a part of the town's history, a defining moment that the survivors would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the sun began to set on that terrible evening, the people of Edmond looked out at the destruction and wondered how they would ever recover. The sky was clearing. The storm had passed, but the nightmare was just beginning. And the full story of what had happened, of all the acts of heroism and all the moments of heartbreak, was only beginning to be told. The sun set over Edmond that evening, casting long shadows across a landscape that no longer looked familiar. The debris field stretched for miles, a chaotic mosaic of broken wood, twisted metal, and shredded fabric. In the fading light, the destruction seemed even more surreal. The colors were muted, the air still heavy with moisture and dust. People wandered through the ruins with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating fragments of lives interrupted. A child's bicycle bent beyond recognition. A wedding photo still in its frame, lying face down in the mud. A kitchen table upside down with plates still stacked on top of it. These were the remnants of ordinary days, now scattered like leaves in the aftermath of an extraordinary storm. The Emergency Operations Center was set up in the parking lot of a damaged shopping center. Volunteers and first responders worked by the light of generators, coordinating search efforts, triaging the injured, and accounting for the missing. The Red Cross had already set up cots and serving stations. The smell of coffee and canned soup mixed with the smell of wet wood and gasoline. Exhausted families huddled together under blankets, their eyes hollow, their voices barely a whisper. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, as if speaking them aloud might make them real, might help them process the unthinkable. One of those families was the Mitchells. They had lived in the Oak Tree subdivision for 3 years. Their home was a 2-story colonial with a big backyard where their 2 girls played. When the sirens went off, they gathered in the interior hallway on the first floor. The father, Tom, held his daughter's clothes. His wife, Carol, held onto a doorframe. The tornado hit with such force that the house seemed to explode around them. Tom later said it was like being inside a cement mixer. When the storm passed, they were buried under debris. Tom dug himself out, then dug out his wife, then dug out his daughters. All 4 of them were bruised and cut, but they were alive. Their house was gone. Their car was gone. Everything they owned was scattered across the neighborhood. But they had each other. That was all that mattered. Across town, a different story unfolded. The Thompson family had a storm cellar. It was a concrete bunker dug into the ground with a heavy steel door and a padlock. But that afternoon, the father, Mark, had been at work when the sirens went off. He couldn't get home in time. His wife, Karen, and their 2 children went into the cellar alone. They huddled in the dark, listening to the roar above them. The cellar held, the house above them did not. When they emerged, they found nothing but a concrete slab. Mark arrived an hour later, frantic, searching through the rubble. He found his wife and children sitting on the front steps of a neighbor's house, which had also been destroyed. They embraced and wept. They had lost everything, but they had survived. The stories of survival and loss continued to pour in. At a local church, the pastor, Reverend John, had just finished a counseling session when the sirens went off. He ran to the basement where several members of the congregation had already gathered. They prayed together as the storm raged overhead. The church was heavily damaged, the steeple collapsed, the roof torn off, but the basement held. Everyone inside survived. Reverend John spent the next several days conducting funerals and offering comfort. He said that the storm had tested their faith, but it had not broken it. The church would rebuild, the community would heal, but not everyone found solace in faith. For some, the trauma was too deep. A woman named Angela lost her husband and her mother in the same storm. She was left alone with a 3-year-old daughter. In the months that followed, she struggled with depression and anxiety. She could not sleep, she could not eat, she could not stand the sound of wind. She moved away from Edmond, hoping to escape the memories, but the memories followed her. She would later say that the tornado took not only her loved ones but also her sense of safety. She would never feel secure again, no matter where she lived. The first few weeks after the tornado were a blur of activity. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, arrived to assess the damage and coordinate relief. The governor declared a state of emergency. The president authorized federal aid. Insurance adjusters set up temporary offices in trailers. Volunteers came from all over the state and even from other states to help with the cleanup. They brought chainsaws, crowbars, and strong backs. They worked from dawn until dusk, clearing debris, salvaging what they could, and offering a helping hand to anyone who needed it. The scale of the destruction was staggering. More than 100 homes were destroyed or heavily damaged. Dozens of businesses were leveled. Hundreds of people were displaced. The estimated cost of the damage was in the tens of millions of dollars, but the emotional cost was incalculable. The community had lost 13 of its own. There were funerals every day for a week. The grief was palpable, hanging over the town like a fog. But even in the midst of that grief, there were moments of kindness that shone through. A local restaurant owner, a man named George, opened his kitchen to anyone who was hungry. He cooked hundreds of meals free of charge for first responders and survivors. He worked until he collapsed from exhaustion. A group of college students from the University of Oklahoma drove up to Edmond and spent a weekend helping a family salvage their belongings. A retired carpenter, a man named Bill, spent 2 weeks rebuilding a porch for an elderly couple whose home had been partially destroyed. He refused to accept any payment. He said it was his way of giving back. The media descended on Edmond, cameras and microphones everywhere. National news networks sent reporters to cover the story. They interviewed survivors, showed footage of the destruction, and told the world about the tragedy. But for the people of Edmond, the media presence was both a comfort and a burden. It meant that their story was being heard, that the world knew what they had endured. But it also meant that they could not escape the constant reminders of what had happened. Every time they turned on the television, they saw their own streets, their own homes, their own grief playing out on the screen. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock began to fade. The debris was cleared. The homes began to be rebuilt. The insurance checks arrived slowly, painfully, but they arrived. The town started to look normal again, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, the scars remained. The survivors of the Edmond tornado would carry the memory of that day with them forever. They would hear the sound of wind and feel a chill run down their spine. They would see a dark cloud on the horizon and feel their heart race. They would never again take a clear blue sky for granted. The storm also changed the way the community prepared for future disasters. In the years after the tornado, Edmond invested heavily in storm shelters and early warning systems. The city required all new homes to be built with reinforced safe rooms. The schools conducted regular tornado drills. The Emergency Management Office developed a comprehensive plan for responding to severe weather. The tornado of 1986 became a catalyst for change, a reminder that nature was unpredictable and that preparation was essential. But perhaps the most profound change was in the hearts of the people who lived through it. They learned that life was fragile, that everything they owned could be taken away in an instant. They learned that community was everything, that neighbors were the first line of defense in a crisis. They learned that grief was a shared burden and that healing was possible only when they came together. The Ernest family, the Mitchells, the Thompsons, the Angies of the world, all of them were forever changed. Some of them would go on to become advocates for tornado safety. Others would quietly rebuild their lives, never seeking the spotlight. But all of them carried a piece of that storm with them, a scar on their soul that would never fully heal. The story of the Edmond tornado is not just a story of destruction and loss. It is also a story of resilience and hope. It is a story of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and refused to give up. It is a story of a community that was knocked down but not defeated. In the years that followed, Edmond would rebuild not just its buildings but its spirit. The town would grow and thrive, becoming a vibrant suburb of Oklahoma City. But the survivors would never forget the afternoon when the sky turned green and the wind roared and everything changed. As the first anniversary of the tornado approached, the city held a memorial service. Families gathered at the site of the worst destruction. They placed flowers and wreaths on the ground. They read the names of the 13 victims aloud. They released balloons into the sky, a gesture of release and remembrance. The pastor spoke of hope and healing. The mayor spoke of strength and unity. And the survivors spoke of gratitude, gratitude for what they had lost, gratitude for what they had kept, and gratitude for each other. The lesson of the Edmond tornado is one that resonates far beyond the borders of Oklahoma. It is a lesson about the power of nature and the power of the human spirit. It is a lesson about the importance of preparation and the importance of community. It is a lesson about the fragility of life and the enduring strength of love. Every year, as tornado season rolls around, the people of Edmond look to the sky with a mixture of caution and courage. They know that another storm could come at any time, but they also know that they have faced the worst and survived. And that knowledge gives them the strength to face whatever comes next. The final chapter of the Edmond tornado story is still being written day by the people who lived through it. They continue to tell their stories, to pass on the lessons they learned, to honor the memory of those who were lost. And every time the sirens sound, they take a deep breath, gather their loved ones, and go to their shelters. They wait, they pray, and they remember. And every time the sirens sound, they take a deep breath, gather their loved ones, and go to their shelters. They wait, they pray, and they remember. For some, the memory is a sharp, precise thing like a photograph burned into the mind. For others, it is a blur of noise and motion, a collage of sounds and feelings that resist any simple order. But for all of them, the memory is alive. It lives in the way they check the weather app before leaving the house. It lives in the way they glance at the western sky on a humid spring afternoon. It lives in the way they teach their children to crouch low, to cover their heads, to stay silent and still until the all-clear sounds. A man named David, who was 7 years old when the tornado hit, now has children of his own. He tells them the story every year on the anniversary, not to frighten them, but to teach them. He describes the green sky, the sound like a freight train, the moment his mother pulled him into the bathroom and held him against the tub. He describes the silence afterward, the smell of mud and splintered wood, the sight of his neighbor's house turned into a pile of sticks. His children listen with wide eyes and they ask questions. Was anyone killed? Yes, he says, 13 people. Did you know any of them? No, he says, but I knew their names, I knew their faces, I knew they were part of my town. In the years after the tornado, Edmond became a laboratory for storm preparedness. The city's emergency management office, once a small operation with a few volunteers, grew into a professional agency with full-time staff, state-of-the-art communications equipment, and a network of spotters who were trained to read the sky. The local National Weather Service office, which had been criticized for its handling of the warning, overhauled its procedures. New radar algorithms were developed to detect the telltale hook echo that signals a tornado. Warning times increased from minutes to tens of minutes. By the time the next major tornado struck the Oklahoma City area in May of 1999, the warnings came early enough to save hundreds of lives. But the people of Edmond knew that technology alone was not enough. The tornado of 1986 had taught them that the most important tool was community, a neighbor who knocked on your door, a coworker who called to warn you, a stranger who stopped to help you out of a collapsed building. In the aftermath of the storm, the city established a network of neighborhood watch groups that doubled as disaster response teams. They stocked community centers with supplies. They trained volunteers in basic first aid and search techniques. They created a phone tree that could reach every household within minutes. And they held annual drills in which the entire town participated, from the youngest child to the oldest retiree. The drills became a rite of passage. Schoolchildren learned to duck and cover as naturally as they learned to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. They practiced walking single file to the designated safe areas, their hands over their heads, their faces serious. Teachers carried laminated cards with the drill instructions. Parents received notes from the school explaining what to expect. And every time the sirens were tested, on the first Saturday of the month, people stopped what they were doing and listened. It was a sound that could still make the heart race, but it was also a sound of reassurance, of preparation, of a community that had learned to face its fear. Still, no amount of preparation could erase the trauma. A woman named Carla, who had been a teenager in 1986, could not hear the sound of rain without feeling a knot in her stomach. She had been at home alone when the tornado struck. The power went out. The house shook. She hid in the closet, listening to the roar, praying that it would end. When it was over, she stepped out into a world that had been turned upside down. Her house was still standing, but the street was unrecognizable. She walked through the debris, calling for her parents who had been at work. She found them hours later, safe, but the minutes of waiting had carved a groove of terror into her soul. Decades later, Carla still struggled with that fear. She sought therapy. She learned coping techniques. She could talk about the tornado without crying. But every time the sky turned green, she felt a primal urge to run, to hide, to curl into a ball and wait for the world to end. She learned to manage it, but she never fully conquered it. And she was not alone. Support groups sprang up in Edmond for survivors of the storm. They met in church basements and community centers. They shared their stories, their nightmares, their strategies for getting through a bad day. They became a family, bound together by a shared experience that outsiders could never fully understand. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Edmond tornado was the way it transformed the lives of those who helped in the aftermath. A young paramedic named Tom had been one of the first responders on the scene. He had pulled bodies from the rubble. He had comforted the dying. He had carried a child to the hospital only to learn that the child's parents had not survived. The experience haunted him. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He left his job. He struggled with alcohol. But years later, he found a new purpose. He began speaking to emergency responders about the importance of mental health. He founded a nonprofit that provided counseling to first responders across the state. His pain had become a bridge to help others. The tornado also changed the way the town remembered its dead. In the first few years, the memorial services were solemn affairs, filled with tears and recitations of the names. But as time passed, the tone shifted. The anniversary became a celebration of life, a reunion of survivors, a chance to honor the spirit of the community. Families would gather at the site where the worst damage had occurred, now a small park with a granite monument. They would bring picnic baskets and blankets. They would release lanterns into the sky, each one carrying a message to the lost. Children would play on the grass, unaware of the horror that had once taken place there. And the adults would sit in folding chairs watching the children, feeling a bittersweet mixture of sorrow and joy. The monument itself was simple, a curved wall of polished granite inscribed with the names of the 13 who had died. Below each name, a small engraved image, a rose for a woman, a football for a boy, a book for a teacher. Visitors would often touch the names, running their fingers over the letters, as if they could somehow connect with the person behind the stone. They would leave flowers, toys, coins, and notes. One note left by a mother who had lost her daughter simply said, "I miss you every day." In the years that followed, the city of Edmond grew. New subdivisions sprouted on the outskirts, their homes fitted with the required safe rooms. New businesses opened, their owners aware that they were building on ground that had been scoured by wind. The population swelled, and many of the newcomers had no memory of the tornado. They moved to Edmond because of its schools, its safety, its sense of community. They did not know that the community had been forged in fire, or rather in wind, and that its strength came from a shared history of loss and recovery. But the old-timers remembered. They saw the new faces and smiled, knowing that those newcomers would never understand the full weight of what it meant to be an Edmondite. They would never know what it felt like to dig through the ruins of a friend's house. They would never know the sound of a mother crying for her child in the dark. And that was okay. The old-timers carried that knowledge for everyone. They were the keepers of the memory, the ones who would point to the sky and say, "That green, I've seen that green before." And the newcomers would nod, knowing that they were in the presence of someone who had faced the worst and survived. The legacy of the Edmond tornado extended far beyond the town's borders. In the decades after the storm, the science of tornado prediction advanced rapidly. Doppler radar became the standard. Storm chasing evolved from a fringe hobby into a serious research discipline. The National Weather Service implemented a system of storm-based warnings, replacing the old county-wide alerts with more precise polygons. And all of these advances were built in part on the lessons learned from storms like the one that struck Edmond in 1986. The data collected from that day, the satellite images, the radar sweeps, the eyewitness accounts, helped meteorologists understand the behavior of tornadic supercells in the southern plains. But for the people of Edmond, the science was secondary. What mattered was the story. And the story was passed down, generation to generation, in the way that all great stories are passed down. It was told at family gatherings, around dinner tables, at school assemblies. It was written in scrapbooks and journals, recorded on camcorder tapes and later digitized. It was spoken in classroom presentations and church sermons. The story of the Edmond tornado became a part of the town's identity, a foundational myth that reminded everyone who lived there that they were survivors, and the story continued to unfold. In 2013, a massive tornado struck Moore, Oklahoma, just south of Oklahoma City. The people of Edmond watched the coverage with a sense of déjà vu. They saw the same images they had seen 27 years earlier, the twisted metal, the shattered homes, the dazed survivors wandering through the wreckage. They knew what the people of Moore were going through. They knew the shock, the grief, the slow process of recovery. And they knew what to do. Within hours, a convoy of trucks from Edmond was on its way, filled with water, food, blankets, and tools. Volunteers from Edmond arrived to help with the search and rescue. The survivors of the 1986 tornado had not forgotten. They understood that the only way to survive a storm was to stand together. In the end, the Edmond tornado was not just a disaster. It was a crucible. It tested the town and found it strong. It broke hearts but did not break spirits. It took lives but gave back a legacy of preparedness and compassion. The 13 who died were not forgotten. They were woven into the fabric of the community, their names spoken with reverence, their stories told with care. And the survivors, the ones who lived through that terrible afternoon, carried a quiet wisdom that could not be taught in any school or read in any book. They knew that life was precious. They knew that love was the only thing that mattered. And they knew that when the sirens sounded, they had a choice. They could hide in fear or they could hide in hope. They chose hope. And so the story continues. Every spring when the skies darken and the wind begins to howl, the people of Edmond remember. They remember the green sky. They remember the roar. They remember the silence that followed and the cries of those who had lost everything. They remember the faces of the helpers, the strangers who became friends, the neighbors who became family. They remember that they are part of something larger than themselves, a community that chose to rebuild, to heal, to grow, and to keep the memory alive. The tornado of 1986 is not just a chapter in the history of Edmond. It is the heartbeat of the town, a pulse that thrums beneath every new building, every new face, every new day. And when the next generation asks, what was it like, the answer is always the same. It was terrifying, it was heartbreaking. But it was also beautiful because in the midst of the destruction we discovered what we were made of. And what we were made of was each other. The survivors of the Edmond tornado never stopped telling that story. They told it to the journalists who came back years later for anniversary pieces. They told it to the students who interviewed them for history projects. They told it to their grandchildren who listened with the same wide eyes that their parents had worn. And they told it to themselves in the quiet moments before sleep, when the wind rattled the windows and the old fear stirred in their chests. They reminded themselves that they had faced the worst and come through. They reminded themselves that they were strong. And so the sirens still sound, and the people still take a deep breath, gather their loved ones and go to their shelters. They wait, they pray, and they remember. But now there is something else in that waiting. There is a quiet confidence, a knowledge that they have done this before, that they will do it again, and that whatever comes, they will face it together. The tornado of 1986 is a scar on the land, but it is also a badge of honor. It is a reminder that even in the darkest storm, the human spirit can shine. Years later, when a historian asked a survivor what the most important lesson of the Edmond tornado was, the survivor did not hesitate. She said the lesson is that you cannot control the wind. You cannot control the weather. You cannot control the chaos of the world, but you can control how you respond. You can choose to help. You can choose to love. You can choose to rebuild. And that choice, made again and again by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, is what makes a community. The historian wrote that down. She underlined it. And she thought about the thousands of survivors of other storms, other disasters, other moments of unimaginable loss. She thought about how each community had its own story, its own scar, its own way of healing. And she realized that the story of Edmond was not unique, it was universal. It was the story of every town that had ever been tested, every family that had ever been broken, every person who had ever looked into the face of destruction and decided to keep going. So the story of the Edmond tornado is not just a story about Oklahoma. It is a story about all of us. It is a story about what it means to be human in the face of forces that are larger than ourselves. It is a story about the small acts of kindness that hold the world together. It is a story about the courage to wake up the next morning, even when everything has been taken away. And it is a story that will be told as long as there are people who remember, as long as there are skies that turn green, as long as there are winds that roar. The Memorial Park in Edmond stands silent most days, a place of quiet reflection. But on the anniversary it comes alive. Families gather, strangers embrace. The names on the granite are read aloud one by one. And at the end, when the last name is spoken, there is a moment of silence so deep that you can hear the wind in the trees. Then someone begins to sing. It is an old hymn, the same one that was sung at the funeral service 30 years ago. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The voices join one after another until the whole park is filled with song. And in that song there is a promise. It is a promise that the tornado will not have the last word. That death will not have the victory. That grief will not be the end. The people of Edmond carry that promise in their hearts. They carry it when they go to their shelters. They carry it when they emerge into the sunlight and see what remains. And they carry it into the future where new storms will come and new generations will rise and the story will continue, told and retold, until the wind itself learns to listen. The survivor named Angela, the one who lost her husband and her mother, eventually found a measure of peace. She did not return to Edmond, but she visited the memorial every year. She would sit on the grass alone and talk to the wind. She would tell her husband about the daughter who had grown up, married, had children of her own. She would tell her mother about the garden she had planted, the roses that bloomed every spring, and she would whisper her gratitude not for the storm but for the love that the storm had not been able to destroy. That love, that unbreakable bond, is the true legacy of the Edmond tornado. It lives in every safe room that was built, every drill that was practiced, every story that was told. It lives in the way the town looks to the sky with both fear and faith, and it lives in the hearts of all those who choose to remember. And it lives in the hearts of all those who choose to remember. To remember is not merely to recall a date, a time, a wind speed. It is to carry the weight of that afternoon into every decision that follows, It is to look at a clear blue sky in early May and feel a flicker of unease. It is to know deep in the bones that the world can change in a matter of minutes. The people of Edmond carry that knowledge with them the way a soldier carries a scar from an old battle. It is not a burden they chose, but it is one they bear with a quiet dignity. Consider the story of a man named Robert who was 20 years old in 1986. He was a volunteer firefighter at the time, one of the first to reach the worst-hit neighborhoods after the tornado passed. He had never seen anything like it. He remembers stepping out of the fire truck and feeling the ground shift under his feet, not from aftershocks but from the sheer unreality of the scene. Houses that had been there that morning were gone, reduced to piles of splintered wood and twisted metal. Cars were wrapped around trees like ribbons. A child's bicycle hung from a power line, its frame bent into a question mark. Robert and his fellow firefighters worked through the night, digging through debris with their bare hands, hoping to find survivors. They found bodies. They found empty shoes. They found a photograph of a family, still intact in its frame, lying in the mud. Robert put that photograph in his pocket and kept it for years, not knowing whose family it was, but feeling a responsibility to hold onto something that had once mattered. Robert eventually became the chief of the Edmond Fire Department. He retired after 30 years of service, but he never stopped telling the story. He spoke at schools, at community meetings, at disaster preparedness conferences. He told the same story every time, the story of the green sky and the roar and the silence that followed. He told it not to frighten people, but to prepare them, because he had learned that preparation is the only antidote to fear. When you know what to do, when you have practiced it until it becomes instinct, the fear does not disappear, but it loses its power to paralyze you. That was the gift the tornado gave to Edmond. It taught them that the worst could happen and that they could survive it. The legacy of preparedness took many forms. In the years after 1986, the city of Edmond adopted some of the strictest building codes in the state for new construction. Safe rooms became standard in schools and public buildings. The emergency alert system was upgraded, and the National Weather Service worked closely with local officials to improve the accuracy of tornado warnings. But the most important change happened in the hearts of the people. The tornado had shown them that the government could not save them, that the police and fire departments could not reach everyone in time. The only real protection was the community itself, so they organized. Neighborhood watch groups became neighborhood disaster response teams. Churches formed volunteer brigades. The local hardware store started stocking extra batteries, bottled water, and first aid supplies. It was as if the whole town had become a single organism, ready to react to the next threat. That readiness was tested many times in the decades that followed. In 2003, a powerful tornado struck the nearby town of Moore, causing catastrophic damage. Edmond remembered. Volunteers from Edmond were on the scene within hours, carrying the lessons of 1986 into the chaos. They knew what to bring, what to say, what to do. They knew that the first thing survivors needed was water. The second was a hand to hold. They knew that the debris field could be confusing, that survivors might wander in a daze looking for their loved ones. So they set up a central gathering point, just as someone had done for them years before. They brought clipboards and markers and started a list of names, the living and the missing. They brought food that did not need to be cooked because there was no power. They brought blankets because even in the Oklahoma spring the nights could be cold, and they brought their listening ears. They sat with people who had lost everything and let them talk or cry or sit in silence. They did not offer platitudes. They did not say everything happens for a reason. They simply said, we are here and we will stay as long as you need us. That kind of compassion does not come from a training manual. It comes from experience, from having been on the other side of the equation. The volunteers from Edmond did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as neighbors. They had been where the people of Moore were now. They knew that the road ahead was long and painful, that the grief would not fade quickly, that the nightmares would last for years. But they also knew that the road was passable. They knew that life could be rebuilt, not in the same way, but in a way that honored what had been lost. They carried that knowledge with them like a lantern in the dark. And the people of Moore remembered. When a devastating tornado struck Edmond again in 2013, hitting a different part of the city, the people of Moore were the first to send help. They sent trucks full of supplies, and they sent people, men and women who had learned the same hard lessons. The cycle of giving continued. It became a tradition, a sacred duty. The tornadoes that struck Oklahoma were not just natural disasters. They were catalysts for a kind of generosity that transcended geography. The towns were connected by a shared experience, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and find something worth keeping. But the story of the Edmond tornado is not only about the immediate aftermath or the long recovery. It is also about the quiet moments that happen years later when the storm has become a memory and the scars have faded. It is about a woman named Gloria who was 70 years old when the tornado struck. She had lived in her house on Ninth Street for 40 years. The house was destroyed, but she survived because she had taken shelter in her bathroom, lying in the tub with a mattress over her head. After the tornado, she moved in with her daughter in another part of town. She never rebuilt. She said she was too old to start over, but she did not leave Edmond. She stayed because this was her home. She attended the memorial services every year. She sat in the same spot near the back and she listened as the names were read. She did not speak. She did not cry. She just nodded as if acknowledging an old acquaintance. And when the service was over, she would walk slowly to her car, leaning on a cane, and drive home. One year, a young reporter approached her and asked why she kept coming. Gloria looked at the reporter with a steady gaze. She said, "Because if I stop coming, then the tornado wins. It takes my house, it takes my street, it takes my husband, and it takes my memory. But I won't let it take my place. I belong here. This is where I was meant to be. That is why I come." The reporter wrote that down. It became the lead of her article. And when the article was published, the people of Edmond read it and understood. They understood that the memorial was not just for the dead, it was for the living. It was for the ones who chose to stay. The tornado of 1986 also changed the way the town taught its children. In the years that followed, the local schools incorporated tornado safety into the curriculum, but they did not stop at drills. They taught the history. They invited survivors to speak. They showed photographs not to frighten the children, but to help them understand that their town had been tested and had survived. The children learned that the safe room in their school was built because of the tornado. They learned that the siren they heard every first Wednesday of the month was a legacy of that day. They learned that the park where they played with its quiet memorial was a sacred place. They learned that their town was not just a collection of buildings and streets. It was a community bound together by a shared experience that was both terrible and beautiful. One of those children, a boy named Marcus, grew up to become a meteorologist. He chose that path because of the tornado. He was 6 years old in 1986, living in a house that was spared by only a few blocks. But he remembered the sound of the sirens. He remembered his mother pulling him into the hallway and covering him with a blanket. He remembered the fear in her eyes and the relief when the storm passed. He wanted to understand what had happened. He wanted to predict the storms, to give people more warning, to save lives. So he studied hard, went to college, got a degree in atmospheric science. He now works at the National Weather Service in Norman, Oklahoma. Every time a tornado warning is issued, he thinks of the people of Edmond. He thinks of the 13 who died. He thinks of the survivors. And he thinks of the little boy he used to be, huddling in that hallway, wondering why the wind could be so angry. Marcus has seen many tornadoes in his career. He has tracked them from a safe distance, analyzing their rotation, issuing warnings that sometimes save hundreds of lives. But he has never forgotten the lesson of 1986. The lesson is that data and technology are essential, but they are not enough. The people on the ground, the ones who hear the sirens and make the split-second decisions, they are the ones who matter. The tornado warning is only as good as the response it triggers. And the response depends on a community that is prepared, that has rehearsed, that knows where to go and what to do. Marcus tells this story to every new meteorologist who joins his team. He tells them about Edmond. He tells them about the green sky. He tells them that their job is not just to predict the weather. It is to serve the people who live under it. And so the story of the Edmond tornado continues to ripple outward, touching lives that were not even born when the storm struck. It is a story that lives in the architecture of the city, in the data files of the National Weather Service, in the oral histories recorded at the library. It is a story that is told in the hush of a memorial service, in the chatter of a school assembly, in the quiet confidence of a family that knows exactly what to do when the sirens sound. There is a particular day in April every year when the city of Edmond holds a remembrance walk. It starts at the Memorial Park and winds through the neighborhoods that were most affected. The walk is not long, maybe a mile or two, but the pace is slow. People stop at certain houses, certain corners, certain trees. They tell stories. They point out where a house used to be, where a family lived, where a rescue was made. The children who walk with their parents listen with wide eyes. They do not fully understand, not yet, but they will. Someday they will be the ones telling the story. One of the regular walkers is a woman named Linda. She was 16 in 1986. She lost her grandmother in the storm. Linda now lives in a different house in a different part of town, but she comes back every year for the walk. She brings her grandchildren. She shows them the spot where her grandmother's house stood. She tells them about the rose bush that her grandmother planted, the one that somehow survived the tornado and bloomed the next spring. The grandchildren pick a rose from the bush if it is blooming and they place it on the memorial. Linda tells them that the rose bush is a reminder that life finds a way. She tells them that the tornado took many things, but it could not take the beauty that was already in the world. The walk ends at the fire station, where the firefighters who responded in 1986 are honored. Some of those firefighters are still alive. They are old now, their hair white, their hands trembling, but they stand tall when they are introduced. They look out at the crowd, at the faces of people they saved, people they helped, people who remember, and they feel something that is hard to describe. It is pride, yes, but it is also humility, because they know that they did not do it alone. They did it with the help of their neighbors, their friends, their community. The tornado of 1986 was not defeated by any single person. It was defeated by everyone together, and that in the end is the heart of the story. The Edmond tornado was a monster. It was 1,000 feet wide, it packed winds of over 300 miles per hour, it carved a path of destruction that would be studied for decades. But it was not the strongest tornado ever recorded, nor the deadliest. What made it special was not its size or its force. What made it special was the response. The response showed the world what human beings are capable of when they set aside their differences and work together. It showed that compassion can be as powerful as any storm. It showed that the bonds of community are stronger than concrete and steel. So when the sirens sound in Edmond today, the people do not panic, they do not freeze, they move with purpose. They gather their children, their pets, their emergency kits. They go to their safe rooms, their basements, their interior hallways. They wait, they pray, and they remember. They remember that they have been through this before. They remember that they have the strength to face it again. And they remember that when the storm passes, they will emerge into the light and they will find each other and they will start rebuilding. Because that is what they do, that is what they have always done, that is who they are.